What I am about to lay out for you is not speculation, not a hot take, and not a recycled narrative dressed up for clicks. This is a structural shift unfolding in real time, and the reason most people will miss it is because they are still trained to look for confirmation from institutions that are already exiting. Right now, while headlines are focused on rates, elections, and distractions engineered to keep attention fragmented, the financial system is undergoing a quiet reconfiguration that will permanently change how value is stored, priced, and defended. This moment will not be marked by a single crash candle or a dramatic announcement. It will be remembered as the point where paper promises stopped functioning as substitutes for physical reality. If you are still thinking in terms of charts, targets, and traditional cycles, you are already behind. The system you are operating inside is not breaking suddenly. It is being abandoned deliberately by those who understand its failure mechanics. Over the past 2 weeks, something critical happened during the lowest liquidity window of the year, the period when senior risk managers step away and junior desks are left running containment systems they barely understand. Those systems failed, not partially, completely, and the evidence is now visible to anyone willing to look past surface-level price action. The silver market is not behaving like a volatile asset. It is behaving like a resource under extraction pressure. That distinction matters more than any price target you have ever heard. For decades, silver functioned as a synthetic market where hundreds of paper claims existed for every real ounce. That structure only works when delivery is rare, trust is intact, and arbitrage remains functional. All three conditions are now breaking at the same time. When experienced institutional risk teams returned to their desks at the start of the year, they were not greeted by a normal post-holiday reset. They walked into a crime scene. Positions that were supposed to be neutralized were exposed. Inventory buffers that were assumed to exist had already been drained. Counterparties that were considered stable were suddenly requesting emergency liquidity. This is not how healthy markets behave. This is how systems behave right before control is lost. The most important signal is not price acceleration. It is behavior. Large players are no longer defending structure. They are securing access. When banks stop prioritizing price optimization and start prioritizing exit certainty, you are no longer in a functioning discovery environment. You are in a rationing phase. This is why recent price moves feel irrational to traders. Sharp spikes followed by violent drops are not signs of indecision. They are signs of forced positioning. Shorts are being covered not because sentiment shifted, but because risk models broke. Longs are being liquidated not because the thesis failed, but because liquidity is being hoarded elsewhere. In parallel, physical markets are sending a message that paper markets cannot absorb. Premiums are not rising gradually. They are detaching. Dealers are not running promotions. They are restricting supply. Delivery times are not extending because of demand alone, but because replacement cost is becoming uncertain. When replacement cost is unknowable, price becomes secondary to possession. This is the line most people do not understand until it is too late. The financial media will never explain this clearly because their framework depends on stability narratives. They will tell you volatility is normal, that markets overreact, that things will rebalance, but rebalancing requires inventory. It requires trust. It requires time. All three are disappearing simultaneously. The deeper issue is that the paper system was designed to smooth price, not survive scarcity. When scarcity arrives, every tool used to suppress price accelerates depletion. More paper claims pull more metal. More suppression creates more delivery demand. This feedback loop is now active. And once it crosses a certain velocity, it cannot be reversed without changing the rules entirely. History shows exactly how this ends. When delivery obligations exceed available supply, exchanges do not default openly. They invoke emergency clauses. They settle in cash. They redefine fulfillment. At that moment, price becomes relevant because access has already been decided. Those holding physical metal are no longer participants in a market. They are holders of a bottleneck asset. Those holding paper are creditors in a system that just repriced their claim downward. The most dangerous mistake you can make right now is assuming this is about upside potential. This is not about chasing gains. This is about avoiding structural loss. The people exiting first are not speculators. They're custodians of balance sheets that cannot tolerate asymmetric exposure. When they move, they do not announce it. They execute quietly, ahead of narrative shifts. By the time the story becomes mainstream, the exits are already constrained. What you are witnessing now is the early phase of a separation event, where paper and physical diverge permanently. Once that separation completes, there is no mechanism to reunite them at the old ratios. The market does not snap back to equilibrium. It establishes a new one at a much higher cost of access. This is why timing matters more than precision. You do not need to predict the exact peak or trough. You need to understand which side of the structural divide you are on before the rules change. Because once they do, reaction becomes impossible. In the next part, I'm going to break down exactly how the delivery mechanism is failing, why registered inventory numbers matter far more than total stock figures, and how the illusion of available supply is maintained right up until it collapses. What comes next is not theory, it is arithmetic, and arithmetic does not negotiate. What most people miss when they look at inventory numbers is that not all ounces are equal, and this misunderstanding is deliberate. Total inventory figures are used as psychological camouflage. They are designed to reassure, not inform. The only number that matters in a delivery-driven crisis is registered inventory, the metal that is actually for sale, actually deliverable, and actually committed to backing contracts. Everything else is decoration. Eligible inventory is not supply. It is privately owned metal parked in vaults for storage, collateral, or strategic reserve. It does not belong to the exchange. It is not obligated to meet delivery, and in a stress event, it behaves like it does not exist. This is where the paper market breaks down mathematically. When open interest expands while registered inventory contracts, leverage does not just increase, it becomes terminal. You reach a point where even a modest percentage of contract holders demanding delivery overwhelms the system instantly. That point has already been crossed. The delivery data from the opening days of the year confirms it. Tens of millions of ounces were demanded in a matter of hours, not weeks. That is not normal rollover behavior. That is extraction. When extraction accelerates, exchanges rely on two tools: discouragement and delay. They raise margins to force weak hands out, and they stretch delivery timelines to buy time. Both tools are failing. Margin hikes are no longer intimidating participants who are no longer trading for price exposure but for metal access. Delays are no longer credible when alternative markets are paying dramatically higher physical premiums. This is why arbitrage has broken. Under normal conditions, price gaps close because metal moves. Today, metal does not move because logistics, insurance, geopolitical risk, and availability have all converged into a single constraint. When transport is booked, routes are compromised, and replacement supply is uncertain, arbitrage dies. Once arbitrage dies, global pricing fragments. That is the most dangerous phase of any commodity crisis because it signals that markets are no longer communicating. New York can print a price. Shanghai can print a different one. Tokyo can trade at a third. None of them are wrong. They are simply pricing different realities. Paper silver is priced where trust still exists. Physical silver is priced where trust is already gone. This divergence is not temporary. It widens as scarcity deepens. The critical mistake analysts make is assuming that higher prices incentivize supply fast enough to stabilize the system. That logic only applies when production can respond quickly. Silver cannot. Most silver is a byproduct of copper, lead, and gold mining. You cannot turn on silver production independently. Even at elevated prices, new supply takes years, not months. Meanwhile, demand is not discretionary. Industrial demand does not pause because price rises. Military demand does not negotiate. Strategic buyers do not wait for pullbacks. They lock supply forward directly at the source, bypassing exchanges entirely. When this happens, exchanges lose relevance before they officially fail. This is why large industrial buyers are already operating outside the future system. They are securing output at the mine, paying premiums that never appear on screens, and accepting delivery risk because non-delivery is no longer an option. Once that behavior spreads, paper markets become residual, not primary. They set reference prices that fewer and fewer participants actually use. The moment an exchange is forced to settle in cash, even once under stress, its credibility is permanently damaged. From that point forward, every contract carries an embedded question mark. Will this be honored in metal or neutralized in currency? Markets do not tolerate that ambiguity for long. Participation collapses or migrates. This is why force majeure is not a solution. It is an admission. It keeps the system alive legally while killing it economically. The deeper danger is that once physical delivery stops, price discovery shifts entirely to bilateral and regional markets. At that point, transparency disappears. Price becomes whatever clears locally, and volatility explodes because liquidity is thin and fragmented. This is when governments step in, not to stabilize markets, but to prioritize access. Export controls, strategic stockpiling, and national allocation frameworks are not emergency measures anymore. They are policy tools. China understands this. That is why export waivers were shut down without warning. They are not reacting to price. They are reacting to future scarcity. When a country controls refining capacity and sees downstream demand exploding, exporting becomes self-harm. The West is still thinking in market terms. The East is already thinking in resource security terms. That asymmetry matters more than any technical indicator. The final illusion that breaks is the idea that cash settlement is harmless. It is not. When holders are paid in depreciating currency, while the asset they wanted continues to rise elsewhere, trust does not recover. It collapses. And once trust collapses, participation never returns at scale. This is why the current phase feels unstable but quiet at the same time. The violence is happening under the surface, in logistics, in contracts, in bilateral deals you will never see reported. By the time price reflects it cleanly, the opportunity to act will already be gone. In the next part, I will explain why central bank liquidity injections are not rescue operations, but accelerants, how they feed directly into commodity scarcity, and why this creates a self-reinforcing loop that no policy tool can stop once it starts. The instinctive reaction when people hear about central bank intervention is relief. Liquidity equals stability. Bailouts equal control. That instinct is wrong in commodity crises, especially ones rooted in physical scarcity. Liquidity does not solve shortages. It magnifies them. Every dollar injected into a system where supply is fixed or contracting increases the pressure on the remaining physical units. This is the paradox that policymakers never admit publicly, because acknowledging it would expose the limits of monetary power. Central banks can neutralize credit crises. They cannot neutralize material constraints. When the Federal Reserve injects emergency liquidity to prevent delivery defaults, it is not creating silver, it is increasing the number of dollars chasing fewer ounces. That mechanically raises the incentive for anyone holding physical metal to refuse sale. Why accept paper promises when replacement cost is rising faster than the currency being offered? This is how liquidity support turns into hoarding behavior. And hoarding is rational, not emotional, when replacement risk dominates price risk. The more aggressively central banks intervene, the more aggressively physical holders withdraw from the market. This is the doom loop. It is not theoretical. It is observable in real time. Each liquidity injection coincides with tighter availability, higher regional premiums, and longer delivery times. The market interprets intervention not as reassurance, but as confirmation that something is wrong. Sophisticated participants read emergency actions the same way predators read blood in the water. They move faster, not slower. This is why volatility spikes after interventions instead of calming down. The system is signaling distress while claiming stability. That contradiction erodes confidence faster than silence ever could. The most dangerous phase of any market breakdown is when official messaging diverges from operational reality. Screens say one thing, vaults say another, logistics say something else entirely. At that point, models fail because models assume fungibility. They assume that dollars, contracts, and ounces can substitute for one another under stress. They cannot. Substitution fails when delivery fails. And delivery fails when inventories hit critical thresholds. Those thresholds are not publicized because acknowledging them would invite a run. But runs happen anyway when informed actors move first. This is what you are watching now. A silent run on physical silver, conducted by institutions that understand timing better than narratives. They are not trying to profit from price. They are trying to avoid being trapped in a system that will choose winners and losers administratively once it breaks. When force majeure is invoked, contracts are not honored equally. Settlement terms change. Priority is assigned. Legal language replaces market clearing. That is when access matters more than exposure. Owning a claim is useless if you're not on the right side of the priority stack. This is why large players are abandoning leverage entirely. They are collapsing complex derivative books, not because volatility is high, but because counterparty risk is no longer quantifiable. When you cannot trust delivery, you cannot price risk. And when you cannot price risk, you exit. This is also why we are seeing behavior that looks contradictory to casual observers. Banks liquidating both longs and shorts. Funds reducing gross exposure even when they believe price will rise. This is not bearishness, it is distrust. They are stepping out of a market that no longer functions as a market. Price discovery requires participation from both sides. Once one side retreats for non-price reasons, discovery ends. What replaces it is episodic repricing driven by scarcity events, not continuous trading. That is when charts become meaningless and headlines lag reality by weeks. The retail layer always notices last because it is insulated by interfaces designed to hide friction. Apps still show quotes. ETFs still trade. Accounts still update. None of that guarantees convertibility. Convertibility is tested only when you ask for the thing itself. That is the moment of truth, and it is the moment the system is trying to delay as long as possible. But delays compound pressure. Every postponed delivery becomes a future problem multiplied by time. Meanwhile, geopolitical constraints tighten the noose further. Export controls, shipping disruptions, insurance exclusions, and strategic stockpiling are not independent variables. They stack. Each one removes flexibility. Flexibility is what allows markets to absorb shocks. Once flexibility is gone, shocks transmit instantly. This is why the current situation feels nonlinear. Small events produce outsized reactions because buffers are gone. There is no slack left in the system. The illusion of abundance persists only because accounting categories mask reality. When registered inventory approaches zero, the distinction between eligible and unavailable becomes academic. Metal that will not move is functionally absent. At that point, the exchange is a price broadcaster, not a marketplace. The next phase is not a smooth repricing, it is a discontinuity, gaps, halts, rule changes, and administrative settlements. This is when narratives flip from complacency to outrage overnight. In the next part, I will explain how industrial demand and national security priorities guarantee that any paper collapse will be followed by physical lock-in, why supply will not return to the open market even at extreme prices, and how this transforms silver from a tradable asset into a strategic reserve almost by default. What most observers still underestimate is how quickly industrial demand transitions from price sensitive to price indifferent once supply security becomes the dominant variable. Industrial users do not speculate, they secure continuity. When production lines, defense systems, or national infrastructure depend on a material, the question is not what it costs today, but whether it will be available tomorrow. Silver has crossed that threshold quietly. Solar manufacturers, semiconductor firms, battery developers, and defense contractors are no longer optimizing procurement for price, they are optimizing for certainty. That shift is irreversible once it begins, because reversing it would require a surplus large enough to rebuild confidence, not just inventories. No such surplus exists. Mining supply cannot respond in time because silver is overwhelmingly a byproduct metal. You do not turn on silver production by flipping a switch. You need copper, zinc, and lead demand to justify expanded extraction. And even then, the timelines stretch years into the future. Recycling helps at the margin, but high-tech applications consume silver in ways that make recovery uneconomic or impossible. Once silver is embedded in circuitry, panels, and weapon systems, it is effectively removed from circulation. This creates a ratchet effect. Demand rises structurally while supply responds slowly or not at all. Prices can spike, crash, and spike again, but availability trends in one direction. This is why industrial buyers are bypassing exchanges entirely. Long-term offtake agreements, prepayments at the mine gate, and direct state-to-state arrangements are replacing spot procurement. When that happens, the open market shrinks even if headline production numbers remain unchanged. Fewer ounces are contestable. Fewer ounces set the marginal price. That makes the system fragile because small disruptions now move the entire curve. National security adds another layer that markets are structurally incapable of pricing. Militaries do not disclose stockpiles, drawdowns, or forward procurement schedules. When defense ministries quietly reclassify materials as strategic, transparency disappears by design. Silver has joined that category without announcement. Guidance systems, communications hardware, energy storage, and advanced electronics all rely on it. Once defense procurement enters the competition for supply, civilian markets lose by default. Governments can override price, contracts, and even property rights under emergency frameworks. This is not speculation, it is doctrine. Strategic materials are secured first, explained later. That reality ensures that any future price spikes will not bring relief through increased supply, because supply will already be spoken for. The open market becomes residual. This is how assets transition from commodities into reserves. They stop circulating freely and start sitting in vaults, facilities, and classified warehouses. At that point, price becomes a poor signal because it reflects only the desperation of the marginal buyer, not the abundance of the system. This is why historical analogies to past squeezes are incomplete. In previous cycles, intervention restored flow. Today, intervention accelerates fragmentation. Every attempt to stabilize paper claims undermines confidence in convertibility. Every attempt to suppress price incentivizes withdrawal. The result is a market that still trades but no longer clears. You see volume without resolution, activity without equilibrium. This is not a bubble. Bubbles require excess supply of belief. This is a scarcity cascade driven by physical constraints, geopolitical fracture, and institutional self-preservation. The most important implication is behavioral. When participants realize that selling may mean permanent loss of access, they stop selling. That is, the line markets cannot cross without breaking. Once holders prefer uncertainty to liquidity, price loses its coordinating function. The system then moves toward allocation by power rather than exchange. Those with leverage, jurisdiction, or force secure supply. Those without adapt or are rationed out. This is the endgame phase, not because of drama, but because of arithmetic. You cannot deliver what you do not have. You cannot print atoms. You cannot rebuild trust once it is replaced by verification. The final mistake will be assuming there is still time to wait for confirmation. Confirmation arrives only after the structure has already changed. By then, the market you thought you were participating in no longer exists.